Alright, Anon. Let me share a real cool story about a Soviet trackman, straight from my grandfather who worked on the metro. First off, let me clear something up. Those stories about homeless people getting eaten at night on the metro, total nonsense. In reality, the metro at night is not empty at all. Once the trains stop running, workers and trackmen head down into the tunnels to check things out. My grandfather was one of those guys, a trackman. We were really close. We lived near each other, went fishing often, and he would tell me all these wild stories about the metro while we were out there. So, what does a trackman do? Basically, they walk through the metro tunnels at night, flashlight in hand, checking the rails for any problems, whether it's damage or just random stuff on the tracks. If they find anything, they either fix it on the spot or call in workers if it's a bigger issue. Sounds pretty intense, right? Just imagine walking alone in a dark tunnel with nothing but a flashlight, trying to convince yourself that you're a brave Soviet citizen and that there's nothing to be scared of. And if something does happen, well, the valiant police will come to save you. At least, that's what you hope. Anyway, my granddad had been doing this job for a few years and had gotten used to it. One night, he was on his usual route, walking from Perovo station to Novogoriva, after which he was supposed to head to the depot and report in. But that night, something strange happened. He was walking along, inspecting the rails as usual, when he suddenly saw this bizarre sight ahead of him, what looked like a rusty web. He got closer and realized it was not a web at all. It was twisted, rusty metal reinforcement bars, old and gnarly, forming some kind of structure. Now, this freaked him out because there was no way that thing could have appeared in just a few hours. He was already nervous, but turning back was not an option. Perovo was too far, and Novogoriva was closer. So, he decided to keep going and report in when he got there. Now, this part really shook him up, and my granddad was not the kind of guy to scare easily. He was a fun-loving, confident man, quite the ladies' man, even in his 50s. His last wife was 27, while he was 54. So, for him to be this rattled, it had to be something serious. As he continued down the tunnel, he saw another structure just like the first, but this one was even worse. It was covered in what looked like guts, and it seemed like the whole thing was breathing, moving. No matter how far he shone his flashlight down the tunnel, he could not see past the darkness. It was as if the tunnel itself was swallowing the light. And then he started hearing noises, rustling, sobbing, voices pleading. That's how he described it to me. At that point, he panicked. He sprinted back to Perovo, terrified. When he got there, he immediately called the dispatcher and told him everything. They brought him into the office, made him retell the whole thing, had him sign a non-disclosure agreement, and then sent him home with almost a week off. So yeah, Anon, that's one of the many crazy stories my grandfather told me about his time working in the metro. Makes you wonder what the hell goes down on there at night, huh? I'll be sharing more stories about him and his colleagues in the future. Here is another chilling tale from my grandfather. He used to say that the section of metro they worked in was not the darkest. Disappearances were rare, and when they did happen, most people were eventually found. However, he warned that if you wandered too far into a passage, you might as well consider that person lost. Searching would be futile. Their shift often communicated with guys from other shifts who had some terrifying stories. The ring road was especially notorious. According to my grandfather, it was a nightmare down there. Some trackmen and workers had even been found hanging. He recounted that sometimes a trackman would stumble upon a piece of rail that seemed to appear out of nowhere across the tracks. When they called the workers to investigate, there would be no response, no greetings. Instead, they would find the workers hanging from hooks nailed to the ceiling of the tunnel. Now, my grandfather was skeptical of these tales, since he had never witnessed anything himself and did not know those guys well. But then came the story he told me one night. He was on his usual rounds, walking between the Marxist and Illich Square stations. As he was walking, he heard rustling behind him. He stopped and shone his flashlight back, but there was nothing there. Just my imagination, he thought. After a few moments, he heard it again. He stopped once more, and the noise died down. Straining his eyes into the darkness beyond the beam of his flashlight, he felt as if someone was watching him from the shadows, sending chills down his spine. Then he noticed faint traces on the sleepers, either pus or some sort of ichor. It was disgusting. There was a smooth strip of the stuff on the sleepers, and several of them looked rotten and cracked, while everything toward the station appeared clean. Feeling unsettled, he hurried toward the station, almost running. Behind him, he could still hear that rustling noise. When he reached the platform, he stood there trembling, gazing into the darkness, trying to shake off the feeling of dread. He thought maybe he was just overreacting. He went to the station master's office and reported that a few sleepers were broken, requesting a worker to assess the damage. They directed him to the workers' restroom, where he found only one person, Rodion. He was a cheerful young guy, studying to be a mechanic and working part-time on the night shift. My grandfather did not mention the strange substance, thinking Rodion might notice it himself. But no, the young man rambled on about his parents and girlfriend, completely oblivious to his surroundings. Finally, my grandfather led Rodion to the broken sleepers. He stood there, listening for any sounds, but it was dead quiet while Rodion continued to chat away. Rodion examined the damage and concluded that the sleepers needed replacing, but said he could patch them up for now and would call in a repair crew later. As my grandfather was about to leave, he heard a noise behind him. Not a scream, but something akin to a sob, followed by a dull thud. He turned his flashlight back and saw Rodion's face at the very edge of the light. My grandfather rushed toward him and realized something was dragging Rodion into the tunnel. Rodion did not scream. He just stared at my grandfather silently, terror in his eyes. What horrified my grandfather the most was the sight of Rodion's eyes, bloodshot, as if all the blood vessels had burst. In that moment, a glimmer caught the light of the lantern, and a wheezing sound filled the air. My grandfather could not tell if Rodion was wheezing or if it was coming from whatever was dragging him. Panicking, he sprinted away as fast as he could, feeling a shame that haunted him for years afterward for not helping Rodion. When he reached the station master looked at him skeptically. Breathless and terrified, my grandfather recounted what he had seen. The station master just stared at him like he was drunk and asked for Rodion's name. My grandfather replied, "Rodion." They went to the workers' room, but when they arrived, Rodion was sitting on the couch. The station master called out to him, but there was no response. My grandfather's heart sank. The station master shook Rodion awake, only to find him disoriented and looking as though he had not slept for days. His face was gone, and worst of all, there was blood on his uniform around the stomach area, a lot of it, and it looked fresh, not yet clotted. The station master, bewildered, asked Rodion what had happened. After a brief silence, Rodion quietly replied that he had cut himself. The station master told him to sit tight while he called for an ambulance. My grandfather bolted out of the door after him. They summoned the chief doctor and the police to the station, who followed the small trail of blood droplets stretching from the workers' room to the tracks. But when they searched the area, Rodion was nowhere to be found. They only discovered a toolbox near the broken sleepers. The police shrugged, unable to make sense of it, and eventually left. The station master then warned my grandfather to keep quiet about the incident, assuring him that he would handle it without involving the KGB. After that night, my grandfather seriously considered changing jobs for the first time. He was terrified by what he had witnessed and the lingering question of what had really happened to Rodion. My grandfather had a treasure trove of stories from his time working in the metro, some of which still send shivers down my spine. He often shared tales from the late night shifts with his team of track walkers. After their rounds, they would gather in the utility room for a couple of glasses of blue and trade stories about their adventures or misadventures on the tracks. Most of the tales were just typical locker room banter, but one of their crew stood out. The guy was a former zoologist or biologist, though nobody could quite figure out how he landed a job in the metro. He was inconspicuous, but a notorious drunkard. When he was not working, he would regale his colleagues with outlandish stories about how the metro was an entirely new ecosystem just waiting to be discovered. My grandfather and the others usually listened half-heartedly, nodding along while rolling their eyes at his absurd theories, which sounded concocted under the influence of more than just alcohol. One night, my grandfather and another trackman decided to stay longer than usual. They did not feel like heading home just yet when the drunken scientist burst into the utility room, launching into another bizarre narrative. He spoke of his nocturnal wanderings along the tracks, investigating dark corners in search of a new branch of evolution, presumably a way to fill the void of his scientific aspirations. Then, the story took a turn. He claimed to have wandered into an abandoned passageway, one that clearly had not seen use in years. At the end of this tunnel, he said he felt paralyzed, as if something was holding him there. A voice from the darkness allegedly beckoned him, demanding that he bring more people to unveil some hidden truth. When pressed for details, he became vague, mentioning something about a web in the darkness, but failing to elaborate on any new evolutionary discoveries. The men exchanged skeptical glances, twirling their fingers at their temples in disbelief, and eventually left for the night. In the days that followed, the scientist approached all of the patrolmen, inviting them to join him on his next patrol. They did not report him to the authorities, thinking he might sober up and return to normal. Then one day, he vanished without a trace, leaving behind no flashlight, jacket, or sign of where he might have gone. After several days of searching, my grandfather's shift was tasked with finding him. Their boss did not want to involve the police. He feared the incident would tarnish their reputation. They scoured the tunnels, hoping to uncover some clue. Eventually, they stumbled upon the men's glasses, abandoned between Shos Enthusiastov and Perova. Next, they found his watch in a side branch. Though it felt eerie, they decided to press on and investigate the area where they found his belongings. However, after just a few minutes of walking, the atmosphere became oppressive. Some of the men reported hearing strange whispers, while others felt as if the walls were closing in on them. My grandfather understood their fear. The beams were rusty, and the wood rotting. It was unsettling. In the end, 7 robust men turned back, nearly running to escape the suffocating dread of that passage. After their return, stories began to circulate that someone had seen the missing scientist lingering around that area, or had heard his voice echoing from the shadows. But these were just tales, until 2 months later, when a corpse was discovered on the very same stretch of tracks. What remained was an almost naked skeleton, with clothes folded neatly beside it, containing the man's identification documents. The body had been gnawed on extensively, and the official report attributed his death to a drunken misadventure leading to dehydration. My grandfather, however, was unconvinced. He had seen the corpse and noticed the marks on the bones, which were far too severe for mere rats to inflict. Some bones were ground down to the point of being powdery. Plus, rats wouldn't neatly fold clothing or carry an entire skeleton from one place to another. This chilling tale encapsulates the darkness lurking beneath the surface of the metro, a world filled with hidden dangers and unsettling mysteries. I have not added anything to the story. Every detail comes directly from my grandfather's words. The trackman's grandson is here, ready to share another unsettling tale from my grandfather's time in the metro. This one veers away from the mysticism but still carries a creepy vibe. One day, while doing his scheduled rounds, everything seemed routine. There were no issues with the tracks, but my grandfather could not shake a sense of unease. Just the day before, a fellow trackman from another shift had gone missing. He was lost in thought when he spotted a light flickering in the distance. Confused, he wondered why anyone else would be there. Instinctively, he thought about leaving. His years of experience had taught him that if you see or hear something suspicious, it's best to vacate the area as quickly as possible. As he stood there contemplating, the light drew closer, and a voice called out from the shadows, asking who was there. My grandfather felt a wave of relief when he recognized the voice. It belonged to an older trackman he often saw around the depot. This man had worked for about 15 years, and despite his gruff exterior, he was friendly and frequently dropped by for a drink and some conversation, often lamenting his lack of friends outside of work. When they greeted each other, my grandfather could not help but ask, "Was it you who went missing?" The old man shook his head, explaining it was a different guy, a new trackman on their shift. The old man revealed he had lost his wallet with important documents somewhere on the track. After drinking half a liter the night before, he had passed out and hadn't realized he was missing. My grandfather considered the situation. He had already walked a good distance and had seen no sign of the wallet. Still, the old man was insistent that they should retrace their steps along both sides of the tracks. Although trackmen have a belief that going back for something lost is a bad omen, my grandfather decided to help. They continued on, with my grandfather on one side of the tracks and the older man on the other, discussing the recent disappearance. As they walked, my grandfather asked if the missing man had acted strangely. The old trackman shrugged, saying he was just a typical newbie, curious about urban legends, like rats the size of dogs. They shared a laugh, reminiscing about their own initiation into the job. They had passed 2 stations without finding anything when suddenly, a loud crunching noise echoed from the direction of the older man. They froze, listening intently. The sound stopped, only to start again, sending a chill down their spines. Exchanging nervous glances, the old man whispered, "Let's see what it is." My grandfather hesitated, suggesting it might be something wrong with the wiring. Nevertheless, they approached cautiously, shining their lights in the direction of the sound. As they drew closer, the light illuminated a technical passage that sloped downwards. They ventured into the passage, their beams revealing strange chalk drawings on the walls, what looked like stick figures and other bizarre shapes. After a few meters, they both froze in terror. 2 figures emerged from the shadows, hunched over and naked, their emaciated frames covered in skin that clung tightly to their bones. My grandfather later recalled how they resembled humans, but with an unsettling, almost animalistic quality. The figures were bent over something, a grotesque, bloody pile of rags that my grandfather recognized as a subway uniform. When the figures turned to face them, they initially shielded their eyes with their hands, but then locked their gaze onto my grandfather and his companion. My grandfather was captivated, unable to look away. The figures moved slowly toward them, still hunched over, with their eyes devoid of any emotion. It felt as if he were in a trance, paralyzed by fear. Instead of running, he found himself backing away until his back hit the wall of the main tunnel. Beside him, the old man seemed equally entranced. The figures did not pursue them further into the passage. They remained, staring silently. In that moment, my grandfather felt a strange compulsion and thought he might have glimpsed more figures lurking in the shadows, but he could not be sure. Then, something snapped in both men. They turned and bolted down the tunnel, racing toward the station without looking back. They arrived breathless and terrified, making a beeline for the depot. There, still trembling with fear, they did not mention what had happened. Instead, they drank vodka in silence in the kitchen until they passed out at a table. In the morning, they awoke to a startling discovery. The older man's wallet and documents were found in the fridge. Apparently, in his drunken state the night before, he had put them in there without realizing. This is a story relayed to me by my neighbor, an elderly man who spent over 50 years working in the metro. He began as a driver, but as his health declined, he transitioned to a different role at the station. One fateful day, an incident occurred that still haunts him. A group of typical gopniks boarded a subway car at a station near their neighborhood. They were loud and boisterous, their drunkenness hovering just below the threshold of chaos. Shortly after the train departed, it came to an abrupt halt in the dark tunnel. They waited a few minutes, but the impatience of their nature got the better of them. With a shout of, "What's going on? Fuck," One of them flung open the door and stepped into the tunnel. It's important to note that this was the last car, and the station was only a 5-minute walk away. Undeterred, the Gopnik headed down the tracks toward the station. Meanwhile, a concerned passenger alerted the driver, who had seen the doors open and knew something was amiss. They quickly notified the station, shutting off the voltage on the contact rail, and assembled a team to search for the foolhardy Gopnik. The team consisted of a couple of cops, a station official, and my neighbor. After 10 minutes of searching without a sign of him, the station management braced themselves for the worst, fearing they would soon recover the scorched remains of the idiot who had touched the contact rail before the voltage was cut. Then, they spotted him in the distance, not far from the station. As they approached, a growing sense of dread hung in the air, but no one could quite put a finger on why. Upon reaching him, the officers' faces turned ashen, and the station master collapsed from a heart attack. The Gopnik lay on the tracks, his legs contorted unnaturally, his mouth agape as if he had been screaming. His expression was frozen in a grimace of horror, but what truly horrified them was his condition. He was cut in half, bisected precisely along the rail. It was as if a train had passed over him, leaving him lifeless and mangled, his body grotesquely sprawled across the track. As my neighbor recounted the tale, he could not help but reflect on his own experiences. Many times, he had glimpsed figures walking in the side tunnels, assuming they were repairmen or inspectors, dismissing them as just part of the job. But after learning that no one was supposed to wander those tunnels during operation, he began to look closer. His neighbor advised against it, warning that sometimes it's better to not see what lurks in the shadows. The drivers, he said, often witnessed things that left them gray-haired by 30, sometimes leading to serious health issues. And these were not just urban legends of rats the size of bulldogs. Reality was far more chilling. Take, for instance, the infamous case of a drunken driver who fell out of his cabin while relieving himself. Drivers often spoke of a girl in a white dress walking along the tracks in that area. If she faced the train, it was said that the driver would be fine, but if she was walking toward him, it meant certain doom. Rumors circulated that those drivers would only have 3 days left to live. Some occurrences were not visual at all. In the quiet tunnels, especially early in the morning or late at night when there were fewer passengers, you could sometimes hear light footsteps on the roof of the train. Standing near the doors, one might distinguish scratching or knocking from the other side. And then there were the inexplicable screams heard at the station. Screams that seemed to echo from nowhere, different from any ordinary sound. My neighbor recalled an instance near the Lenin Library, where he had to stop the train for a signal. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a dark corridor beside the driver's cabin. As he stopped the train, he felt a chill wash over him. There was something unsettling about it, but he forced himself to look away, knowing he had to wait for the signal. Time passed, and when the green light finally illuminated, he bolted out of there as if he had been stung. But an insatiable curiosity compelled him to glance back, and what he saw left him trembling. A translucent face hovering in the air outside the window, with impossibly wide cheekbones and ghostly white eyes. Neither he nor any of the other drivers ever saw that corridor again. So, heed this advice. Don't look too closely at what's passing by the train window. You never know what, or who, might be looking back at you from the darkness. This tale comes from my grandfather, who spent countless nights working in the metro. One evening, as he walked from his dormitory to the station, he ran into a fellow shift worker returning from either a late stroll or a quick trip to the store. They exchanged pleasantries about how everyone was doing, but the conversation soon shifted to work. The shift worker shared some unsettling news he'd heard from friends about strange happenings on the Philsky line, specifically between the Philly and the Bergrashnovskaya stations. The trackmen had been unusually uneasy about that stretch. Open tracks were particularly problematic. They frequently had to clear away sticks, branches, and debris. No one wanted to linger there at night, especially in the biting cold of winter. On top of that, there were rumors of homeless people and other unsavory characters seeking refuge in the tunnels. But that night, things escalated to a new level of dread. 3 workers had already vanished without a trace while checking that station, and no bodies had been found. The air was thick with mystery and unease. After a brief conversation, my grandfather bid farewell and hurried to the metro. He changed into his uniform and began his shift, first traveling from Novogoriva to Perova without incident. However, things soon took a turn for the strange. As he proceeded through the dark tunnel, a peculiar odor wafted through the air. It was not a stench, but rather a heavy, slightly sweet scent that made him uneasy. Just then, several ordinary-sized rats scurried past him, seemingly indifferent to his presence. He'd seen rats in all sizes during his career, but he had yet to encounter the infamous giant rats that urban legend spoke of. As he continued, he began to hear the sound of rushing water, which puzzled him. Illuminating the tunnel with his flashlight, he followed the noise until he stumbled upon a shocking sight. The water pipes along the wall were ripped from their mounts, the jagged ends bent outward, and water gushed from them. Alarmed, my grandfather wondered what could possibly cause such destruction to thick iron pipes. Despite the fear gnawing at him, he resolved to press on to Shos in Tetsuya station and report the damage, but that is when the real terror began. A sudden warm breeze brushed against the back of his neck, as if someone had exhaled right behind him. Startled, he rushed forward, tripped over a sleeper, and fell hard to the ground. Rolling onto his back, he shone the flashlight into the darkness ahead, searching for anything amiss, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. After a moment of lying there, he calmed himself and started to get up when he heard a rustling sound coming from behind him, followed by laughter. The laughter was distorted, high-pitched, echoing eerily in the tunnel. My grandfather could not tell if it belonged to a man or a woman, but it sent chills down his spine. As he began to back away, shining his light into the darkness, he heard the same laughter. Now it was coming from both in front of him and behind him. Panic surged through him. This was not fear anymore, it was primal horror. He could barely think straight, his body trembling as he searched for an escape. The grinding sounds intensified, and in a moment of sheer desperation, he sat against the tunnel wall, trying to catch his breath and regain his composure. Just then, he spotted a light in the distance. Someone was calling his name. He leaped to his feet and sprinted toward the light, dropping his flashlight in the process. To his immense relief, it was a colleague sent to look for him. The lineman informed my grandfather that he had been missing for 2 hours, prompting a search party. As he listened to his colleague explain the situation, my grandfather felt a wave of relief wash over him, realizing that the strange sounds had ceased. After they finished discussing the burst pipes, the lineman nodded knowingly, his expression grave. My grandfather chose to keep the bizarre occurrences to himself, concocting a story about fatigue and possibly passing out. Together, they made their way back to where he had dropped the flashlight. As he bent down to retrieve it, his gaze fell on the pipes which his flashlight now illuminated. To his horror, he noticed deep scratches running along both sides of the area where he had sat in fear, stretching for about 10 meters in each direction. The air thickened with unspoken tension as he exchanged glances with his colleague, and they nodded in silent understanding. Mystical phenomena was not heard of in the metro, and while such incidents were rare, they happened. Those who experienced them often kept quiet, unwilling to probe into the unknown. My grandfather was immensely grateful for his colleague's timely arrival. Without him, who knew what could have happened? Reflecting on the eerie 2 hours spent in the tunnel, he marveled at how he had not succumbed to madness from fear. That was the nature of working in the depths of the metro, where the line between reality and the supernatural blurred, leaving the mind to ponder the dark secrets lurking just out of sight.